The alarm clock's shriek was a merciless, digital blade slicing through the fragile fabric of a dream already retreating into the shadows of his subconscious. His hand, a thing of automatic function, found the snooze button in the dark with the unerring accuracy of 3 decades of practice. 6:05 a.m. Tuesday. The room was a cave of familiar shadows, the faint, bruised light of a city dawn barely sketching the outlines of the blinds. This was the overture to another day in the life of Marco Silva, a man whose existence had been meticulously engineered for predictability. At 52, Marcos was a structural engineer not just by profession, but by the very architecture of his soul. His world was one of calculated tolerances, of immutable laws of physics, of concrete and rebar and mathematical certainty. He found a profound, quiet comfort in the known. Life, in his view, was a structure to be built with care, its load-bearing walls made of routine, its foundation poured from responsibility. The woman sleeping beside him, Clara, shifted and sighed, turning her back to the offending alarm. In the half-light, he watched the gentle rise and fall of her shoulders. They were partners in this quiet, well-ordered life. The passionate, electric connection of their youth had mellowed over 20 years of marriage into a deep, abiding companionship, a shared language of silent understandings, of knowing glances across a crowded room, of weathered love. It was a sturdy, reliable thing, their marriage, but sometimes, in his most private thoughts, Marcos wondered if in building such a stable, predictable life, they had accidentally paved over the wild, beautiful garden of their early years together. The ritual began. The creak of the floorboards under his weight was a familiar greeting. The shower was hot and needle-sharp, a daily baptism meant to steam away the lingering ghosts of sleep. He shaved with methodical, unhurried strokes, the rasp of the blade against his skin another note in the morning's symphony. Downstairs, the kitchen awaited, silent and orderly. The coffee maker, a faithful servant, gurgled to life as he measured out the dark, fragrant grounds. A robust, inexpensive blend he'd drunk for years. The rich, bitter aroma was the scent of his morning. Cup in hand, he stood at the back window, looking out at Clara's small, thriving garden. It was October, and the last of her roses held on defiantly, crimson and gold against the fading green, a splash of untamed beauty against the neat fence lines. Upstairs, his son, Pedro, was still asleep. At 10 years old, Pedro's world was a glorious, chaotic explosion of imagination. Lego empires constructed on the bedroom floor, soccer dreams, and an endless stream of questions about a universe that Marcos, in his weary adulthood, often felt too busy to truly explore. A pang of guilt, faint but persistent, stirred in his chest. Today, he promised himself silently. Today, I will really listen when he tells me about his game. I will get down on the floor and look him in the eye. The first sip of coffee was a bitter, life-affirming jolt. He scrolled through the news on his phone, a cyclical parade of political squabbles and distant tragedies that felt abstract, almost fictional, from the quiet isolation of his kitchen. His briefcase sat by the door, already packed. The schematics for the new downtown high-rise, a dense structural report awaiting his red pen, the old scientific calculator that had been his companion since university, its buttons worn smooth by time. Clara padded into the kitchen, her robe tied tight. She didn't speak, just offered a soft, sleep-softened smile and reached for her mug. Their communication was a minimalist ballet of shared habit. "Big day?" she asked, her voice a low murmur. "The usual. The developers at 10. They want to value engineer the steel supports again. I'll have to be the bad guy. Parent-teacher conferences after school. I'll be late for dinner." A nod, a brief, dry kiss on the cheek. It was all part of the script they had written together over thousands of identical mornings. On his way out, he pushed open Pedro's door. The room was a testament to joyful chaos. He bent down and kissed his son's warm forehead, breathing in the sweet, clean scent of his hair. The boy stirred, murmuring without opening his eyes. "Bye, Dad. See you tonight, champ. Love you. Love you too." And then he was in the car, a single atom merging into the sluggish metallic river of brake lights flowing into the city's heart. This was his existence. It was not an unhappy one. It was secure. It was known. It was the product of a lifetime of careful choices. But as he navigated the traffic, a quiet, treacherous thought sometimes whispered from the depths. Is this all there is? Have the grand dreams and wild possibilities of youth simply been sanded down, polished into the smooth, manageable, and utterly predictable life? He would shut the thought down immediately. This was stability. This was success. This was what a man was supposed to build. The workday unfolded with metronomic precision. The meeting ran long. The developers, armed with spreadsheets, pushed to cut costs on materials. Marcos, armed with physics and ethics, pushed back. His was a world of immutable facts. Gravity doesn't negotiate. There was a flurry of emails, a constant stream of phone calls, the relentless tap-tap-tapping of his keyboard. He ate a solitary lunch at his desk, a ham and cheese sandwich on whole wheat, while his eyes traced the lines of a load-bearing diagram. The view from his office window was a square of flat, gray sky. It was, in every sense, a Tuesday. It was late afternoon. The caffeine had worn off, leaving behind a dull throb behind his eyes, the first hint of the day's fatigue. The world outside his window was beginning to dim. His phone, sitting beside the calculator, buzzed with an unfamiliar, jarring rhythm. The screen glowed with an unknown number, prefixed by a long, complex international code. He almost dismissed it. Another spam call, a robot trying to sell him a vacation he didn't want. But a flicker of something, a faint and idle curiosity in his otherwise ordered mind, made his thumb swipe across the screen to answer. The voice that came through was a seismic charge, detonating directly into the quiet, orderly bubble of his Tuesday. It was deeper, roughened by time and distance, but the energy, the unmistakable, irrepressible joy woven through it, was instantaneous and electrifying. Marcos? Marcos, is that you? The voice on the other end of the line was a seismic charge, detonating directly into the quiet, orderly bubble of his Tuesday. It was deeper, roughened by time and distance, but the energy, the unmistakable, irrepressible joy woven through it, was instantaneous and electrifying. It wasn't just a sound. It was a feeling. It was the ghost of 1,000 shared laughs in a university common room, the echo of a friendship that had once been a cornerstone of his world. Lucas. The name felt foreign and familiar on his tongue, a relic pulled from a deep chest of memories. A wide, unbidden grin spread across his face, the tension of the day's meeting and the lingering headache melting from his shoulders. I don't believe it. Where are you? How are you? Where am I? Still in Sydney, mate. Still chasing the sun while you're probably counting snowflakes. Lucas's laugh was a rich, booming thing that filled the sterile office air. So loud and vivid Marcos half expected his old friend to burst through the door. I'm good, Markeo. Better than good. Life's a bloody beach. Literally. But listen, I don't have long, the time difference is a killer. I'm calling for a reason. A big one. The conversation that followed was a whirlwind. Lucas, true to his nature, spoke in excited, cascading paragraphs, barely pausing for breath. He painted a vibrant, sun-drenched picture of his life down under. His wife, Sarah. Their 2 kids who were little Aussie legends. His thriving architecture firm. The sprawling house with a deck that overlooked the Pacific. He was living the grand, impulsive adventure he'd always talked about during their university days, and the sheer, unadulterated joy in his voice was a potent antidote to the gray predictability of Marcos's Tuesday. It was a stark, almost painful contrast to the view of concrete and steel from his office window. And then he delivered the catalyst. His 50th birthday, this Saturday. A huge party, a proper knees-up, right there on Bondi Beach. A gathering of all his friends, old and new. Which is why you have to come, Lucas said, his tone shifting from nostalgic to deadly serious. You just have to. You and Clara and the little man. Non-negotiable. The engineer in Marcos, the part of him that had been in charge for the last 2 decades, immediately kicked into overdrive. A mental spreadsheet snapped open, columns filling with a torrent of insurmountable objections. Lucas, I can't. It's Tuesday. I have a critical project meeting next Thursday. The deadlines are... It's impossible. The flight alone is over 24 hours. The cost of last-minute tickets. The project will be there on Monday, Marcos. Lucas interrupted, his voice softening but losing none of its intensity. The concrete isn't going to get up and walk away. But life will. This life. This moment. Come on, live a little. For me? For old time's sake? I haven't seen you in 15 years. That's too long, brother. He then delivered the masterstroke, the piece of information that shattered Marcos's defenses completely. And before you give me another excuse about Clara, don't bother. I've already spoken to her. Last week. She's been my co-conspirator. She helped me plan this whole surprise call. She thinks you need this. We need this. The revelation was a thunderclap. Clara. His pragmatic, steady Clara was behind this. She had seen the gradual settling of his spirit, the way the light behind his eyes had dimmed under the weight of responsibility and routine. She wasn't just his wife. She was his custodian, the keeper of the man he used to be, and she was handing him a key to unlock him. She had orchestrated this intervention with the one person who could possibly break through his walls. The logical arguments, the spreadsheets of objection, crumbled to dust. The voice of his old friend, the conspiratorial love of his wife, the promise of sun and salt air, and a connection he desperately missed. It all coalesced into a single, irresistible force. Business class, Lucas said, as if reading the surrender in his silence. The tickets are already in my cart. I just need you to say yes. I'm clicking buy right now. Marcos let out a breath he didn't realize he'd been holding. A laugh, genuine and free of worry, bubbled up from a place deep inside him that had been dormant for years. He looked around his office at the blueprints and schedules, and for the first time they looked like what they were. Pieces of paper, not the bars of a cage. You're a madman, Marcos said, the grin evident in his voice. That's why you love me. So, are you in? The word felt dangerous and exhilarating as it left his lips. Yes. The euphoria of saying yes lasted precisely until the email from Lucas landed in his inbox with a cheerful ping. Attached were 3 round-trip, business-class e-tickets from Sao Paulo to Sydney. The confirmation was stark and real, printed in crisp, official typeface. Flight QF 7894. Departure, 22:55. Friday. The return of the engineer was immediate and brutal. A cold wave of practicality washed over him, dousing the warm glow of spontaneity. His mind, so adept at identifying structural weaknesses, began immediately compiling a catastrophic risk assessment. The cost. He did a quick, gut-wrenching calculation of the last-minute price and let out a low whistle. It was more than their last family vacation to Disney. The time. They would land in Sydney on Sunday morning, local time, utterly wrecked by jet lag. The party was Saturday night. They would be zombies, mere spectators to the festivities. His meeting. The crucial project meeting was now just 3 days after their scheduled return. What if the flight was delayed? What if he came down with something from the plane? The sheer, monstrous logistics of it all. Visas packing for a different season, arranging for someone to water Clara's roses, stopping the mail. He carried this turmoil home that evening, a storm cloud hovering over him. But the moment he opened the front door, he was ambushed by pure, undiluted joy. Pedro launched himself at his legs, a whirlwind of excitement. We're going to Australia. We're going to see Uncle Lucas and kangaroos. Clara stood behind him, her eyes shining with a light he hadn't seen in months. She held up her phone, already filled with screenshots of the Opera House and Bondi Beach. The next 48 hours were a blur of frantic, happy chaos. His orderly life was completely upended. His briefcase was abandoned in a corner, replaced with an open suitcase in the middle of their bedroom. Spreadsheets were swapped for packing lists. His lunch hour was spent at a government office for expedited visas, not at his desk. He delegated work, his phone pressed to his ear as he stood in line, trying to sound authoritative while explaining to his project manager that he would be unreachable for a few days due to a family emergency. The silence on the other end was profoundly skeptical. Through it all, a low-grade anxiety hummed in his veins, the constant, nagging whisper of responsibility. It was the ghost of his old self, shaking its head at this madness. Late at night, as Clara slept soundly beside him, he lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Was this incredibly selfish? Was he jeopardizing his professional reputation for a party? What if this entire trip was a colossal mistake? What if the friendship, so vibrant in memory, had faded and they would arrive to find only awkward silences and the ghost of what used to be? The excitement, fueled by Pedro's infectious energy and Clara's palpable happiness, was a powerful force. But it was now locked in a constant, silent battle with a deep, gnawing feeling of doubt. It was no longer just a feeling of impulsivity. It had morphed into something darker, more visceral, a primal sense of foreboding that he couldn't logic away. He dismissed it as pre-travel jitters, the fear of the unknown that any sensible person would feel. But the seed had been planted. It was small, but it had roots, and it was growing in the dark soil of his subconscious. The day of departure arrived cloaked in a surreal, electric energy. The familiar morning routine was abandoned, replaced by a giddy, sleep-deprived frenzy. Pedro had been awake since 5 a.m., his small suitcase, packed and repacked with his most prized action figures and the Lego spaceship for Uncle Lucas, waiting by the front door like a loyal pet. Clara moved through the house with a determined, joyful efficiency, her checklist in hand, a constant, reassuring smile on her face. Marcos, however, felt like a spectator in his own life. He moved through the motions, a tight knot of anxiety coiling in his stomach, the engineer's risk assessment still running on a loop in his mind. The drive to Guarulhos International Airport was a journey into the unknown. The familiar streets of their neighborhood gave way to wide, anonymous highways, the city skyline shrinking in the rearview mirror. The car was filled with a chatter that felt both excited and nervous. Pedro peppered them with questions from the back seat. Will there sharks? Do they speak English? How do you say hello in Australia? Clara answered each one with infinite patience, her hand resting on Marcos's knee, giving it a reassuring squeeze. He forced a smile, his own mind a silent scream of logistics and that persistent, unexplainable dread. The scale of the international terminal was overwhelming, a monument to movement and farewell. It was a city within a city, echoing with a dozen languages, the squeak of luggage wheels, and the distant, distorted voice of the announcer calling out destinations that sounded like dreams. Paris, Dubai, Tokyo. They joined the queue for check-in, and with a final, definitive thump, their bags disappeared onto the conveyor belt, tagged for SYD. The sight of it sent a fresh jolt of anxiety through Marcos. There was no turning back now. Passing through security felt like a ritual of surrender. Belts off, shoes off, laptops out of bags. They walked through the metal detector, arms raised, emerging on the other side slightly disheveled but officially travelers. The airside world was a different universe, a liminal space of duty-free shops and hushed anticipation. They found their gate, and there it was, the aircraft, a colossal Boeing 777, gleaming white under the harsh airport lights. It looked less like a machine and more like a sleeping leviathan. Ground crews in neon vests swarmed around it, fueling it, loading cargo into its belly. To Marcos's analytical eye, it was a masterpiece of engineering, a testament to human ingenuity. But to the father and husband, it suddenly looked vast, alien, and terrifyingly final. He felt a small hand slip into his. Pedro was pressed against the glass, his nose squashed against it, his eyes wide with a mixture of awe and trepidation. It's so big, Dad, he whispered. Marcos knelt down, bringing himself to his son's eye level. The noise of the terminal faded into a dull hum. In this moment, it was just the two of them. He could see the faint reflection of the plane in Pedro's wide, dark eyes. You ready for the adventure, champ? He asked, his voice softer than he intended. Pedro nodded, his expression serious. We're going to see kangaroos. We sure are, Marcos said, pulling him into a tight hug. He breathed in the scent of his son's hair, shampoo, and innocence. You listen to Mom on the plane, okay? And you get to watch all the movies you want. I will, Pedro mumbled into his shoulder. His small arms tightened around Marcos's neck in a vice-like grip. I love you, Daddy. The words, so simple and pure, pierced through the layers of anxiety and doubt. I love you too, Pedro. More than anything in this world. It was a perfect, crystalline moment of connection. Clara joined them, putting an arm around each of them, and they stood there for a long moment, a small, tight-knit unit against the backdrop of the immense journey ahead. She kissed Marcos, a proper kiss, not the hurried peck of that morning. It tasted of love and promise and adventure. The first call for boarding echoed through the gate area. We have to go, Clara said softly, her eyes glistening. Marcos nodded, the knot in his stomach pulling tighter. This was it. He hugged them both one last time, a long, crushing embrace, trying to memorize the feel of them. He watched them walk down the jet bridge, Pedro turning to wave one last time, his small face alight with excitement. He stood there until they disappeared from view. The giant plane waited, its door open like a promise. He turned to leave, a strange emptiness already blooming in his chest. He took a few steps toward the terminal, the image of his family's joyful anticipation etched in his mind. It was then, as the noise of the airport rushed back in, that he heard it, a sound that cut through everything like a knife. The first call for boarding had been a gentle invitation. The second was a firm instruction. Marcos watched as the line of passengers began to snake its way down the jet bridge, a river of rolling suitcases and backpacks flowing toward the open aircraft door. He saw Clara's bright scarf ahead, a spot of color in the muted crowd. Pedro was holding her hand, his small frame almost lost between the adults. They were almost at the threshold. A profound loneliness washed over Marcos, a physical ache. The terminal, once a place of excitement, now felt vast and hollow. He had done it. He had pushed them out of the nest, out of the safety of their routine, and toward an adventure. It was the right thing. It was what Clara wanted, what Lucas wanted, what the ghost of his younger self would have demanded. He took a deep breath, turned away from the gate, and began the long walk back to the empty car, to the empty house, to the life that suddenly felt like a waiting room. The airport noise was a dull roar. The hum of the PA system, the distant beep of a baggage cart, the murmur of 1,000 conversations. He had taken maybe 10 steps when a sound sliced through the cacophony, clear and sharp and desperate. Asterisco, papai. Asterisco. It was Pedro's voice, but it was wrong. It wasn't the excited shout from earlier. It was a high, thin wire of pure panic. Marcos spun around, his heart hammered against his ribs. Pedro had broken free from Clara's grip and was running back through the jet bridge entrance, against the flow of passengers. His little face was a mask of terror, tears already streaking down his cheeks. Clara was right behind him, her expression a mixture of confusion and alarm, trying to apologize to the annoyed passengers her son was squeezing past. Pedro didn't stop until he crashed into Marcos's legs, his small body trembling violently. He wrapped his arms around his father's waist, holding on as if he were clinging to a rock in a raging river. Pedro, meu Deus, what is it? What's wrong? Marcos knelt, his hands on his son's shoulders, trying to meet his eyes. The fear he saw there was absolute and primal. It was not the fear of a scary movie or a big dog. This was something deeper, something ancient. The boarding agent was looking over, concerned. The final call was announced, her voice more urgent now. Final boarding call for Qantas Flight 7894 to Sydney. All passengers, please proceed immediately to Gate B17. Pedro was sobbing now, great, heaving gasps that made it hard for him to speak. He shook his head, his words coming out in a choked, desperate whisper. It was a sound meant only for his father's ears, a secret past in the space between them. Don't get on that plane, Daddy. Please, please don't make us go. Marcos's blood ran cold. What? Why, son? What's the matter? Are you scared to fly? It's okay. It's safe, I promise. No. Pedro insisted, his voice cracking with an intensity that was frightening. He wasn't articulating a childish fear of turbulence. This was a certainty. You can't get on that plane. It's not safe. Clara reached them, her face pale. Marcos, what is going on? Pedro, darling, we have to go. They're going to close the door. He says the plane isn't safe, Marco said, his voice low, his eyes locked on his son's. He's just nervous, honey. It's a big trip. Come on, Pedro. Clara tried to gently pry him loose, but the boy held on with a superhuman strength born of pure terror. No, Mommy. Listen to me, he begged, his eyes wide, pleading. He looked from his mother's frustrated face to his father's stunned one. I had a dream, a bad dream. The plane, it was in the water. It was dark and cold. Please, please, don't get on that plane. A child's nightmare. A silly, irrational fear born of excitement and overstimulation. Every logical fiber of Marcos's being, the engineer who dealt in facts and data, screamed at him to dismiss it, to soothe his son, to be the rational adult, to hand him back to Clara and usher them onto their adventure. But he didn't. He stayed kneeling on the cold terminal floor, held in place by the visceral, undeniable truth in his son's eyes. This wasn't a tantrum. This was a warning. It was the physical manifestation of that gnawing feeling that had been eating at him for days. The seed of doubt had not been his alone. It had been growing in his son's heart, too, and had now burst forth in this terrifying, desperate bloom. The gate agent approached them, her smile strained. Sir, ma'am, I'm sorry, but this is the absolute final call. You must board now, or the door will be closed. The world narrowed to this single, impossible choice. Logic, responsibility, thousands of dollars, a promised reunion. On one side. On the other, the raw, terrified plea of his child and a dread that felt like a cold hand around his heart. Time froze. The gate agent's voice, polite but edged with impatience, was a distant buzz. Sir, I need you to make a decision now. The door must be closed. The words seemed to travel through water before reaching Marcos's ears. The bustling terminal, the murmur of countless conversations, the rhythmic beeping of a baggage cart. It all melted into a formless, muffled hum. The world had been reduced to a single, horrifying spotlight shining on his family, frozen in a tableau of anguish. He was aware of every minute detail, each one etched with surreal clarity. The frantic pulse in Pedro's neck where his small head was buried against his chest. The way a single tear traced a path through Clara's perfectly applied makeup, a tiny crack in her composed facade. The bewildered, slightly irritated looks from the last few passengers shuffling past them into the jet bridge. The stark, fluorescent lighting of the gate area that made everything feel cold and unreal. His mind, the analytical engine that had served him so well for 52 years, short-circuited. It offered no spreadsheet, no risk assessment, no logical pros and cons. It simply presented two images, flashing in his mind's eye with brutal intensity. One image, the three of them walking down the jet bridge. Clara's relieved sigh. Pedro, comforted. His fear soothed away by his father's rational words. The adventure awaiting. Lucas's beaming face at the arrival gate in Sydney. A story to tell for years. Remember when Pedro got cold feet? The other image, the plane. The vast, dark, cold water from his son's dream. An emptiness. A silence where their laughter should be. The cost of the tickets was a number, abstract and meaningless. The missed meeting was a triviality. Lucas's disappointment was a fleeting emotion. All of it was dust. Weighed against the raw, animal terror in his child's eyes, it was nothing. He looked at Clara. Her expression had shifted from frustration to a dawning, profound confusion. She was waiting for him to be the rock, to make the sensible choice, to fix this. But he was no longer the man who made sensible choices. He was a father. He tightened his arms around Pedro, feeling the violent tremors racking his small body. He looked up at the gate agent, his own voice sounding foreign and strangely calm to his ears. We're not going. The words hung in the air, simple and absolute. The agent blinked, her professional smile faltering. Sir, the flight is closed. Your bags will have to be offloaded. This is a final decision. Clara's hand flew to her mouth. Marcos? What are you saying? Her whisper was laced with disbelief. Our bags? The tickets? Lucas? He couldn't explain it to her. Not here. Not now. There were no words that could articulate the primal, gut-deep certainty that had seized him. He could only act on it. I'm sorry, he said to the agent, his voice gaining a sliver of strength. We are not boarding. Please offload our luggage. He stood up, lifting Pedro into his arms. The boy's sobs had quieted to a ragged, hiccuping breath, his entire body going limp with a relief so profound it was exhausting. He buried his wet face in his father's neck, his little fingers clutching the collar of Marcos's shirt. The agent gave a curt, confused nod and spoke into her radio. We have 3 offboards for QF 7894. Passengers Silva. Please offload. The message crackled into the void, sealing their fate. Marcos turned to Clara. Her face was a canvas of shock, anger, and utter bewilderment. The grand adventure she had meticulously planned, the surprise she had orchestrated with so much love, lay in ruins at their feet, destroyed by a child's nightmare and her husband's sudden descent into irrationality. Marcos, she said, her voice trembling, what have you done? He had no answer for her. He just held their son and watched as the jet bridge door was swung shut with a heavy, final clunk. The mechanical sound echoed through the now silent gate area. The light above the door switched from a flashing green to a solid, unblinking red. The plane was gone. They were left behind. The silence that descended after the jet bridge door closed was heavier and more profound than any noise the airport had produced. It was a vacuum, sucking the air from their lungs. They stood there, a frozen island in the river of terminal activity that flowed around them, oblivious to their personal cataclysm. Clara was the first to break. The shock on her face curdled into something hotter, sharper. What have you done? She repeated, her voice a low, dangerous wire. Marcos, look at me. What did you just do? Her gesture swept from the closed gate to their sobbing son still clinging to him. Because of a bad dream? A dream. He had no defense. He could only stand there, holding Pedro, absorbing her anger and confusion. He felt unmoored, his own certainty beginning to waver under the weight of her logical, devastating reality. The agent had disappeared, her duty done. They were alone with the consequence of his decision. A different airline employee, a young man with a clipboard, approached them cautiously. Mr. and Mrs. Silva? We've initiated the bag offload process. It will take some time. You're welcome to wait in the lounge, or... He trailed off, unsure what to suggest. There was no protocol for this. We'll wait here, Marcos said, his voice hoarse. They moved like sleepwalkers to a cluster of empty seats near the gate. Clara sat stiffly, her arms crossed, staring straight ahead at the blank, dark windows of the jet bridge. She wouldn't look at him. The distance between them was now a chasm, filled with thousands of wasted dollars and a broken promise. Pedro had calmed, his breathing evening out into the deep, exhausted rhythm of sleep against Marcos's shoulder. His trust was absolute. His father had heard his plea and had acted. For him, the crisis was over. For Marcos and Clara, it had just begun. The minutes ticked by with excruciating slowness. The giant screen above the gate still displayed their flight information. QF 7894 to Sydney. On time. Gate closed. The words were a taunt. Marcos found himself staring at it, his mind beginning its treacherous work. Asterisk, you fool. You absolute fool. You've ruined everything. You've humiliated your wife, terrified your son, and betrayed your best friend. All because of a childish fantasy. Asterisk. He pulled out his phone. Flight tracker. He typed in the flight number. The little icon of a plane was still on the tarmac. Estimated departure, 23:10. It was 23:07. His heart was a frantic drum against his ribs. He could still be wrong. They could still be wrong. The plane could push back, take off and land safely in Sydney, and his family would be intact, and he would be the man who had a nervous breakdown at an airport gate. 23:09. The icon didn't move. 23:10. A faint roar echoed through the terminal, the sound of a distant aircraft accelerating down a runway. Dozens of planes took off every minute. It meant nothing. 23:12. The icon on his screen refreshed. The status changed. QF7894. Departed. A cold numbness spread through his limbs. It was done. There was no going back. The plane was in the air. His family was safe on the ground. He had chosen a nightmare over a dream. He looked at Clara's stony profile, at Pedro's peaceful, sleeping face, and felt a wave of such profound guilt and doubt he thought he might be sick. He kept staring at the phone. The little plane icon would now begin its journey across the map of South America, out over the endless dark of the Pacific. The flight tracker estimated arrival time. 6:15, Sunday, Sydney time. He set a silent, mental alarm for that moment. For the next 16 hours, his life would be held in suspension, waiting for a notification that they had landed safely, waiting for the proof that he had made the most catastrophic mistake of his life. The wait was an agony. It was a purgatory of his own making. Every minute was an eternity of second-guessing, of rehearsing the apologies he would have to make to Clara, to Lucas. The unblinking red light above the empty gate seemed to stare into his soul, a silent judge of his insanity. He was a man who had bet everything on a feeling, and now he had to wait to see if he had lost it all. The silence in the house was absolute. It was a living thing, thick and heavy, smothering every corner. I stood in the center of the living room for what felt like an eternity, just listening to the deafening absence of sound. The closed study door was a monument to our failure, a physical manifestation of the chasm that had exploded between us. I couldn't bear it. I couldn't stand there in the shrine of my own shattered expectations. I needed noise. I needed something, anything, to drown out the screaming questions in my head. My hand, trembling slightly, fumbled for the remote control on the coffee table, my fingers brushing against the glossy, taunting surface of the cruise brochure. I pointed it at the television and pressed the power button. The screen flared to life with a burst of garish color and obnoxiously cheerful sound. A game show. Contestants were jumping up and down, screaming with joy over winning a new car. The sheer, unadulterated normalcy of it was so bizarre, so violently out of sync with the cataclysm that had just happened in my own life, that I could only stare, numb and uncomprehending. How could the world just continue? How could people be laughing and winning cars when my entire world had ended in a parking garage? I jabbed at the channel button, a frantic, desperate need for distraction driving me. News. A local politician giving a speech. Weather. A forecast for more gray skies. A sitcom. A laugh track that felt like needles in my ears. Another news channel. A commercial for soap. I kept pressing the button, the channels flashing by in a meaningless blur of light and sound. And then I stopped. The screen was filled with a familiar, terrifying sight. Water. Churning, violent, dark water. But it wasn't a nature documentary. The graphic in the corner of the screen wasn't a whale or a shark. It was a news station's logo, and emblazoned over the footage in a stark, bold, blood-red banner were the words, "Breaking news." My breath caught in my throat. The remote slipped from my numb fingers and clattered onto the floor. The camera shot was shaky, taken from a helicopter or a Coast Guard vessel. It zoomed in through a mist of rain and spray on a scene of utter chaos. A ship, a massive, listing cruise ship, tilting at a horrifying, unnatural angle against a backdrop of a furious, steel-gray sea. Its white hull was scarred and dark, a gaping, monstrous tear visible near the waterline. Lifeboats, tiny and desperate, were being lowered into towering waves that threatened to swallow them whole. The distorted, frantic voice of a news anchor cut through the howl of the wind. Asterisk. Reports are still coming in, but we are receiving confirmed footage of a major maritime disaster. The MS Azura Serenade, a cruise liner departing from Bayport just hours ago, has reportedly collided with a submerged cargo container lost in a storm further out to sea. The impact is said to have been catastrophic, breaching multiple hull compartments. Asterisk. The Azure Serenade. The name hit me like a physical punch to the solar plexus, knocking the air from my lungs. My legs gave way, and I crumpled onto the edge of the sofa, my body gone cold and leaden. I couldn't move, couldn't blink. I could only stare, frozen in a state of pure, uncomprehending shock. The screen split. On one side, the horrific live footage. On the other, a pristine, smiling promotional photo of the ship I had been standing in front of just hours ago. The same ship I had desperately yearned to board. The same deck I had imagined myself dancing on. It was now a scene of pandemonium and terror. Asterisk. Declaring a mass casualty event. Coast Guard and emergency services from multiple jurisdictions are responding, but conditions are extremely hazardous with high winds and... Asterisk. The words began to blur, morphing into a meaningless drone. The world around me, the silent house, the gray light from the window, the closed study door, all of it faded into a distant, muffled haze. The only thing that was real, horrifyingly, vividly real, was the image on that screen. My mind, reeling and shattered, began to perform a bizarre, slow-motion calculus. It started connecting impossible dots. Mark's silence, his distance, the dread, the panic, the desperate, last-second refusal to board. The look of pure, unadulterated terror on his face that I had mistaken for a rejection of me. It wasn't about me. It had never been about me. A sound escaped my lips, a small, choked whimper that was drowned out by the frantic news report. My hand rose slowly, trembling violently, and covered my mouth. My eyes, wide with a dawning, terrifying understanding, remained locked on the television screen, on the name of the ship that was now synonymous with disaster. The news banner flashed again, updating with new, horrifying text, feared significant loss of life. And in that moment, the foundation of my entire reality didn't just crack. It vaporized. The anger, the humiliation, the heartbreak, it all vanished, incinerated in the white-hot fire of a terrifying, unbelievable, impossible truth. He knew. Somehow he knew. The news spread like a virus, cold and efficient. News alerts buzzed on phones. The story dominated every channel. The aircraft's registration number, VHEBU, becoming a grim, universally recognized symbol of tragedy. The smiling, hopeful faces of passengers flashed on the screen, their lives reduced to a heartbreaking mosaic of feared lost. And amidst them, the three of them, Clara, Pedro, and Marcos. Their photographs were there too, listed among the passengers. For a few agonizing hours, they were among the lost. Marcos moved through those first days in a state of catatonic shock. He was the architect of their survival, yet he felt like the primary mourner. The phone call to Sarah played on a loop in his mind, the sound of her world disintegrating over a crackling line. He had to make other calls. To his own parents, to Clara's family, his voice a flat, emotionless monotone explaining the impossible. "We're okay. We didn't board. The plane is gone." The cries of relief on the other end were almost worse than grief. They were a spotlight on the miracle he could not comprehend, let alone celebrate. Clara's anger evaporated, replaced by a tremulous, shell-shocked gratitude that was almost more frightening. She looked at him not with warmth, but with a kind of awestruck terror, as if he were a stranger who wielded a dangerous, unknowable power. She would hold Pedro for hours, crying silent tears into his hair, as if needing the physical proof of his existence to ward off the horrific alternative. Pedro, shielded from the worst of the news, understood enough. He knew the bad dream had been real. He knew Daddy had listened. The event forged a new, unbreakable, and slightly frightening bond between them. Pedro would often climb into his lap without a word, just resting his head on his father's chest, listening to his heartbeat, a silent testament to the life that had been spared. For Marcos, the world had been drained of color. It existed in shades of gray. The guilt was a physical weight, a stone in his gut. Every time he saw Lucas's face on the news, every time he thought of the empty seat that should have been his, the what-ifs descended like vultures. What if he had dismissed Pedro's fear as a childish whim? What if he had been the rational engineer and ushered them onto the plane? What if their luggage, now sitting in their hallway like a grotesque souvenir, had been in the hold, adding insignificant grams to the final catastrophic equation? He was drowning in a sea of survivor's guilt. He had been given a backstage pass to fate, and the view was horrifying. He started avoiding the news, but the images were seared into his brain. The endless, choppy gray ocean where the search teams found nothing but a few pieces of floating debris. A briefcase, a seat cushion, a child's stuffed toy. He couldn't sleep. In the dead of night, he would wander into Pedro's room, just to watch the steady rise and fall of his son's chest. He would stand in the doorway of his own bedroom, watching Clara sleep, overwhelmed by the sheer, blinding luck that had kept them in this house, in this life. They were alive, but they were living in a haunted house, the ghost of the life they should have had lingering in every corner. The joy was gone, replaced by a profound and weary gratitude that was too heavy to carry. They had been saved, but they were broken. The price of their survival was the crushing weight of knowing so many others were not so lucky, and the terrifying, unanswerable question of why. The memorials came and went. A public one on a blustery day by the sea, where strangers wept for people they'd never known. A private one in their living room, just the three of them with a single candle lit for Lucas. The world's attention, as it always does, slowly moved on. The news cycles found new tragedies. But for Marcos, Clara, and Pedro, the world had been permanently, irrevocably tilted on its axis. The grayness of those first months began, imperceptibly at first, to recede. It wasn't that the grief or the guilt vanished. They didn't. They simply became woven into the fabric of who they were now, a permanent thread in their tapestry, dark but integral. The change started in small, quiet ways. Marcos didn't go back to the old firm. The high-rise projects, the stress over load-bearing calculations for buildings that felt suddenly meaningless, he couldn't do it. He sold his share. The money from the sale, combined with the life insurance payout from the airline that they never wanted to touch, gave them a freedom that felt both sacred and terrifying. He started his own small consultancy, working from home. He chose projects that meant something, retrofitting old schools for earthquake safety, designing community centers. He came home for lunch every day. The biggest change was in their connections. The near-physical need to be close to Pedro never left him. He became the parent who volunteered for field trips, who coached the soccer team not to win, but to see the joy on the kids' faces. He never again dismissed a question as silly. He got down on the floor with the Legos. He listened, truly listened. With Clara, it was a slower rebuild. The awestruck terror in her eyes gradually softened into a deep, profound reverence. They had to learn each other again. They were no longer just Marcos and Clara, the comfortable married couple. They were Marcos and Clara, the survivors. They started taking walks in the evening, not talking sometimes for blocks, just holding hands. The silence between them was no longer a chasm, but a shared space. They talked about Lucas often, keeping his memory alive not as a ghost, but as a celebration. One evening, a year after that night at the airport, they were in the backyard. Clara's roses were in full, defiant bloom. Pedro, now 11, was trying to teach the dog to fetch. Marcos watched them, his heart so full it ached. Clara followed his gaze and slipped her hand into his. "You know," she said, her voice soft, "I spent months waiting for the other shoe to drop, waiting for the universe to correct its mistake, to balance the scales." He looked at her, a old fear flickering in his eyes. "And now," she smiled, a real warm smile that reached her eyes for the first time in what felt like forever. "Now I think the scales were never meant to be balanced. Some things aren't transactions. Some things are just gifts. Terrible, painful, miraculous gifts." She turned to him, her eyes serious. "You didn't just save our lives that night, Marcos. You gave us a new one. This one." She gestured to their son, to the garden, to the quiet house. You listened to a whisper when everyone else, including me, was shouting. You chose us over everything else. You chose love over logic. Pedro ran up to them then, breathless and grinning, the slobbery tennis ball in his hand. Did you see that? She almost got it. Marcos pulled his son into a hug, breathing him in. He looked over Pedro's head at Clara, and in that moment, the last of the grayness lifted. The guilt would always be a part of him, a quiet scar. But it was no longer the whole story. The story was the weight of his son in his arms. It was the feel of his wife's hand in his. It was the scent of roses on the evening air. He had learned the hardest lesson of all, that the most important calculations aren't made with a calculator, but with the heart, and that the strongest bonds are not forged in the easy times, but in the moments when you stand alone on a precipice, choose love, and step back from the edge, together. The plane that never landed had given them a new earth to walk on, and they vowed, every day, to never take a single step for granted.